Erev Tov L'Kulam, good evening. Welcome to the Thursday night Parsha class, mini Parsha class. I apologize for the clicking. I don't have a separate microphone this evening. Once upon a time, a man was touring in India, and he decides he's going to join one of the groups there. And one of the rules of the groups there is that you're not allowed to talk. You take a vow of silence. And the guy agrees. He says, I'm going to follow the rules. And the rules are that every 5 years you get to say 2 words. 2 words for every 5 years. 5 years go by, and he has his meeting with the master, and he says his 2 words. He says, mattress hard. He goes back to his silence. A few years go by, 5 years go by. He gets his 2 words. And when he stands in the office of the headmaster, he has his 2 words and he says, better food. And then 5 more years go by and he stands in front of the Grand Master and he says, I'm leaving. Those are his 2 words, I'm leaving. And the Grand Master says, good. Since you got here, all you do is complain. The parsha this week is the peak, you could say, of the whole entire Torah. Yeah, it's the standing at Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah from God. The heavens opened up, and the voice of God is heard across the universe. It's an amazing, amazing event. After that great event, there are a few verses that describe a certain mitzvah, and this is something we want to focus on this evening. The mitzvah is about offering sacrifices and making a altar for God, a holy altar for the sacrifices to Hashem. And the mitzvah that Hashem gives us with regards to that activity of making an altar for God is do not ascend to the altar on steps, only a ramp. And the commentaries say, why are you not allowed to go up on steps? Why can't you use steps? Why do you have to use a ramp? The answer is the reason the Torah gives is asher lo yisegale ervascha alav. So you shall not reveal, you shall not walk immodestly on the altar. What exactly is so immodest? What's immodest is that when a person is going up steps, they have to take broad steps. Whereas if you're going on a ramp, you take very short steps because you're afraid of losing your balance. Yeah. So therefore, the mitzvah is that you use only ramps to ascend or descend the altar. But really, what is the issue here? The priests that served in the Holy Temple, that means the Kohanim that served in the Beis HaMikdash, they wore shorts under their robes. There was no real immodesty at all. Then what's the purpose of this whole commandment? The Medrash Mechilta says that really it's more about the attitude of the person than it is about the respect for the altar. That means the Torah is trying to teach us by way of a fortiori. In Hebrew, it's called a kal v'chomer, and I'll explain that in a second. How careful we have to be with respecting others. What's the fortiori? What's the kal v'chomer? If we are obligated by Torah law to respect the stones of the altar that don't hear and don't see and don't feel any shame, how much more so do we have to be careful to respect and never shame another human being who does feel his shame. He can hear and he can see, and he will be affected by what we do and what we say in their regard. How much more so we have to be careful. That's called kal v'chomer, something lighter and something more severe. We have to respect something that cannot feel shame. How much more so do we have to respect something that really does, a human being that really can feel deep shame, God forbid. There's a very nice story associated with this, that one time the Chafetz Chaim, famous for his great care about Lashon Hara and Jewish law in general, he once went to visit. He often went to visit various cities, and when you would go to visit a new city and you were a famous Rav, then the wealthy people in the city would vie to host you. Often it meant a donation to the yeshiva, whatever it was. One of the wealthy men in the city got the opportunity to host the great tzaddik, the Chafetz Chaim. You can imagine the hustle and bustle in the house to prepare to host such an honored guest. Couldn't even imagine. Friday night comes, and the men are home from shul, and the husband notices that the challah, the loaves of challah on the table, are not covered with the traditional Shabbos challah cover. And of course, he doesn't want that the Chafetz Chaim should look at him like a bore, like an ignoramus. And so he gets very nervous, and he calls to his wife and he says, "What's the matter with you? Don't you know that the Jewish people cover their challahs on Friday night?" And this poor lady in front of the Chafetz Chaim, who some people consider him the tzaddik hador, she is shriveling up. She wants to disappear. She's so embarrassed. And the Chafetz Chaim turns to the men and says, there's a reason why we cover the challah loaves on Shabbos. Do you know what that reason is? The man says, of course, because bread is the most important kind of food. And by the Friday night meal, or by any Shabbos meal, we recite Kiddush before we're going to eat the bread. That's a little out of order. The bread deserves greater respect than the wine, but we're going to drink the wine first. So we cover up the bread, not to embarrass the bread, by drinking wine in the presence of the bread. You can already imagine the rest of the story. The Chafetz Chaim says, no, if the challahs who don't really feel any shame, there is no challah in history that ran to her room and cried because her friends are making fun of her. Yeah, it doesn't happen. Nevertheless, the Chazal tell us you have to be so careful about their respect, giving them their honor, not causing them shame. What about the honor of your wife? What about the respect due to a human being? How many more times over do you have to be careful about the respect? Shouldn't you learn a kal v'chomer from the challah? So this is obviously a very important and very central theme in human interactions. But of course, the Rebbe doesn't leave it at that. And the Rebbe pushes Rashi, who brought us this commentary. And the Rebbe asks further, we just had the greatest event. We just had the peak of Jewish history, the revelation of God, the revelation. Without this revelation, you have no Judaism whatsoever. Right? This is the moment. And right after that, the Torah has to tell us about how you're supposed to respect people. The lesson has been brought already in the Torah before, and it'll be brought up again later. Why do we have to bring this here and in such a strange way? Earlier in the Torah, we have a much clearer demonstration of how careful we have to be about shaming people, God forbid. What's the great example we had earlier? You'll remember there was an encounter, there was an event between a great and righteous man called Yehuda, son of Yaakov, one of the 12 tribes, the head of his tribe. He had a son called Er, and when Er came of age, Yehuda found a nice lady called Tamar, and they married, and Er passed away without children. So Yehuda instructed his next son, Oinan, to marry Tamar. That's the Torah way, to establish a family in his brother's name. Oinan also died without children, and Yehuda sent Tamar away to wait for the youngest son, Shelah. The name slips my mind now. To grow up. In the meantime, he grew up, and Tamar sees that Yehuda's not calling for her. So she sets a trap for him. She lures him into her bed. She becomes pregnant from him. Nobody knows. It was a secret. Months later, she's showing that she's pregnant. They take her to court in front of the leader of the tribe, Yehuda. And Yehuda says, a married lady who becomes pregnant outside of marriage, Torah says the death penalty. Tamar doesn't say a word. They're bringing her to be killed. And on the way to her execution, she says, let's swing by the rabbi's house for a minute. I have to give him one message. What was the message? She returned to him at that moment the objects with which he paid for her services. And as soon as he saw that, he realized. And he came out and he made a public declaration to clear her name and take the guilt onto himself. It was his fault that he didn't bring her to marry the younger son. And in those days, it turns out it was the right thing to do for her. Because in those days, before Torah was given, any male relative would be obligated to marry the dead husband's wife to establish a family in his name. So Yehuda would have had the obligation then. He was one of the male family members that had that obligation. But what's the message in the story? What is the powerful, powerful lesson here? Why didn't Tamar say something? Why wouldn't she open her mouth, defend herself, tell the truth? No. Why? She said about herself, it is better, I would rather throw myself into the fire than embarrass a fellow human being. What would happen if I tell everybody what the story is? Yehuda's career would be over. His life would be over. Better die than do that to another human being. Amazing. That is how you establish a powerful point and you emphasize the message. You do not shame another person, no matter the cost. It's no wonder that marriage, Yehuda and Tamar, the children that came from that sacrifice and that golden heart of honesty and strength, is the root from which King David descends eventually, and the Mashiach Tzidkenu will descend eventually. It's a golden source. Yeah. Okay, so now we have a source. We have been taught the message in a most powerful way. Why do we need the message to be taught to us a second time and in such a not powerful way? In a sort of a roundabout kind of skittish kind of way. You have to learn it through a Kal V'chomer, and the rabbis have to explain it to you, otherwise you wouldn't catch the message. Yeah, and it's interesting that the Rebbe is the one that's bringing up this issue, because the Rebbe himself personifies this very, very delicate sensitivity to the feelings of people. The prohibition of going up to the altar on stairs, says the Rebbe, is meant to express to us a detail that we may have missed when we were reading the story of Yehuda and Tamar. What is that? That means that you are not allowed to shame a person ever. Let's open this up. Sometimes a person will do something that causes another person shame. And the person may or may not come to us and say, you embarrassed me, you hurt me. Where do we go from there? We come up with all kinds of excuses, justifications. We wrote something in Facebook, we wrote something in the WhatsApp, we wrote something, or we published something on YouTube, something, and it wasn't right. And the guy comes and says, why are you mixing into my life? Why are you butting into my private affairs? And we say, what? Your life? What? Everybody does this now. You should be immune to it by now. This is the way of the world in our generation. Or you, I could never imagine a person like you should be so sensitive. Grow a little tougher. Why are you being so meek? From the story of the steps on the Mizbeach, we learn that no matter the possible justification, even good and right justifications, true justifications, not the awful nonsense that I shared just now, even in those cases, you are not allowed to shame a person. Never, never. How does the Rebbe learn all of this? Somebody, before we get to the answer, I'm going to share a story about the Rebbe's sensitivity. It happened, anybody who's seen the pictures or the videos of 770, you'll see that in Mincha time, when the Rebbe is listening to the Chazin's repetition or listening to the Torah being read, the Rebbe is always focused 100% on the Siddur, following along every word. And the Rebbe would lean his head on his hands, sometimes two hands, sometimes one hand, focused, perfect focus on the Siddur. The people in 770, they noticed that standard practice, every once in a while, the Rebbe would break. It went on for years this way. It was predictable. And in a certain period of time, there were days when the Rebbe wasn't doing it. And so they did some sleuthing, because Bachrim have the ability to figure things out when they have a little bit of extra time. And they discovered there was an Israeli Bachar named Shimon, who, because of an accident, his face was terribly deformed. It was hard to look at him. And the boys, they tried to avoid him even. It was a pitiful thing. The boy was also blind. Yeah. And his presence made people uncomfortable. You can imagine. People are people. There was no judgment, but there was. Anytime this boy would daven together with the Rebbe's minyan, the Rebbe would not put his hand by his head, by his eyes, like this. Why? We the Hasidim assumed, the Rebbe did not want, and you could track it. When he was there, the Rebbe would not put his hand up. When he wasn't there, the Rebbe's hand went back up. The Rebbe would not want this boy, this Bachar Shimon, to think that the Rebbe was covering his eyes because he didn't want to look at him. The Rebbe doesn't have a good excuse. The Rebbe has two good excuses, perfect excuses. Excuse number one, I put my hand like this every day. Excuse number two, the boy is blind, he'll never know. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. That's the sensitivity of the Rebbe. Wait a minute now. We have to go a little deeper. People think that the most important need of a human being is money. Nobody really thinks that, I hope, right? We realize dignity is a much deeper need in the human being than money is. People earn money so that they could have dignity, so that they could have a sense of self-worth, because the honor that will come from it. However, that's not even enough sometimes. The Rebbe, we'll use the Rebbe's example. The Rebbe didn't want to cover his eyes when a boy who would never know might become offended. Why? It seems irrational. It seems far-fetched. It seems like you're going too far. You're being unreasonable. Says the Rebbe, look at Rashi carefully. Rashi, in his lesson about the steps going to the Mizbeach, tells us how much more so your friend who is created in the image of God, how much more so. You have to be careful about his honor. That's the key. We might think, if the other person will never know, let's say there's a person in the community who is not on Facebook, and he's not on WhatsApp, and he's not on any of these social media network things, and he doesn't read the newspaper, and doesn't listen to the radio, Yeah, in theory, you could say if he will never find out, then what's the harm in expressing myself about that person on those channels? The message that we received in the Torah just after the revelation at Sinai is it's not even about the person. It's about you and God. God created man in his image. That means God has a particular interest in each and every one of us. That means God spent a particular amount of time forming in his wisdom a unique and perfect human being, exactly with the right strengths and exactly with the right weaknesses, exactly with the right skills and exactly with the right shortcomings, exactly the right height, color, shape, everything perfect. And Hashem took the time to do that and create this gem of a human being. Whether or not the person will find out about it, to shame that person, to speak disparagingly about that person, well, it goes much deeper than just the person himself. You're talking now against the Creator himself. Immediately after the giving of the Torah, Hashem tells us, and you may never, and that means ever, shame a fellow human being, because then you and I have nothing to talk about. Yeah, I revealed my will to you, I revealed my heart to you, but you want a piece of me, you must respect your fellow man. Because I created every human being in my own image. I invested my own self in each and every one of them. And if you can't get on the same page as me with regards to my children, you cannot have a relationship with me in terms of my mitzvahs. Thus, therefore, we all do this sometimes. We ought to do it more. Sometimes somebody writes something and you know you have to fire back something. Oopa, they said something you disagree with and you have got to retaliate. If it was a human-to-human discussion, you wouldn't. But on social media, we feel a certain freedom. And that's why that's the subject of today's topic. You have to, we all have to pause and rethink this before we hit the send button. Because the damage that is being done on a constant basis, every second, people's lives are being torn apart. People's moods are being destroyed. People's self-image is being undercut, and good and decent people are being overwhelmed with stress and anxiety and darkness and anger because people around them are not careful what they share in the media. Let's close with another story. This is actually a story that likely didn't happen, but it could have happened. That exemplifies how careful we have to be with the feelings, the dignity of a human being. It happened one time by the tzaddik, they say. It happened one time by the tzaddik Reb Mendel of Rimenov. He was one of the Polish Rebbes, famous. He was known as a man who could work miracles, and so many people wanted to be connected to him. He had so many Hasidim. One time, a person known as a misnagid, an opponent, not necessarily a follower of the Hasidic movement, was visiting around the turn of the Jewish New Year, and he spent Shabbos there, and he wanted to join the Rimenover Rebbe in the recitation of the early morning slichas, the penitential prayers of the early morning that you do just before Rosh Hashanah. And so he starts asking around, when and where will the Rebbe say slichas? He asked one person, when and where will the Rebbe say slichas? And the guy says, well, it's in my business. I don't know. He goes to heaven and he says slichas. Okay, so the guy's in a foul mood. He asks a second person, and the guy says, what are you asking me for? I'm his secretary. He goes to heaven and he says slichas with the angels. And the visitor says, what's this? Everybody's telling me the same. Baba Maisa, what is this thing about the Rebbe saying slichas in heaven? No, I'm going to catch him. I'm going to find out. Apparently, there's something sneaky going on here. I'm going to catch him in. He probably doesn't even get up out of bed. He probably sleeps through slichas. That's the problem, and nobody knows where he is. And they say as if he went up to heaven. That's how they cover for him. Good. That night, he finds a perch near the Rebbe's house where he can watch. Early morning, as the crack of dawn comes, he sees the Rebbe is moving around in his house. Okay, he goes around to his house. What's he doing in there? He's getting dressed. He's getting dressed in casual clothing. Casual clothing. He says, aha, the guy's going to play sheshbesh. he's going out gambling instead of saying slichas. That's what he's doing. Oh, no, he's moving more. What's the Rebbe doing now? He put on a heavy winter coat and this big fur hat like the Cossacks wore. And the visitor doesn't know what's going on. The Rebbe's moving around more. What's he doing? He says he's getting a big hatchet. He says, whoa, so that's the story. The man's a thief. Early in the morning, he's going to go out onto the highway near the village. He's going to attack people coming to visit for the high holy days. He's going to steal their money. Man's a bandit. I have to go tell everybody. The Rebbe's moving more. He goes out to the forest. So this visitor follows him out to the forest. What's he doing? He's chopping wood. He makes a big pile of wood, puts the bundle on his shoulder, goes to a house at the outskirts of town, knocks on the door and says to the lady of the house, hello, it's me. It's Vasily. I'm here to sell you firewood. The lady opens the door. It's a widow by herself, a bunch of kids. And the Rebbe is talking to her like a ruffian from the countryside. And the lady says, what can I do that I don't have money to pay you? He says, don't worry, you pay me when you can. He goes into the house, he lights a fire, he puts up hot water, he makes a warm milk, tea, whatever, cleans up the house a little bit. And then he leaves, promising that he'll be back the next morning with more firewood, more work, and you pay me when you can. And that's how the Rebbe spent his morning. We know stories about tzaddikim who help. We know stories about all kinds of people who help out. But to do it in such a way where you preserve the dignity of the person that you're helping, that's an art. That's an art form that is so precious to Hashem and something that we could learn from. The first message that Hashem wants to give us after he gave us the 10 commandments, the first real life message is you've got to be so careful with the dignity of a human being. If a human being is sinning and breaking the 10 commandments, if you have to scold him, do so where you can protect his dignity at the same time. You want to serve God, it cannot be at the cost of another person's dignity. The visitor, to conclude the story, the visitor is watching this and he says, this is a special human being. I want to be a follower of such a human being. And then he realized, wait a minute. If they would ask me, where does the Rebbe do slichas? Would I not say, he goes to heaven and says slichas there? Of course I would. And maybe even higher than heaven. Because what I just witnessed today is higher than heaven. Thank you for joining. Wish everybody a wonderful Shabbos and good, spectacular news. from everyone that you love.